Economic growth is the increase in the inflation-adjusted market value of the goods and services produced by an economy over time. It is conventionally measured as the percent rate of increase in real gross domestic product, or real GDP, usually in per capita terms. Growth is usually calculated in real terms, i.e. inflation-adjusted terms, to eliminate the distorting effect of inflation on the price of goods produced. Measurement of economic growth uses national income accounting. Since economic growth is measured as the annual percent change of gross domestic product, it has all the advantages and drawbacks of that measure. The rate of economic growth refers to the geometric annual rate of growth in GDP between the first and the last year over a period of time. Implicitly, this growth rate is the trend in the average level of GDP over the period, which implicitly ignores the fluctuations in the GDP around this trend. An increase in economic growth caused by more efficient use of inputs is referred to as intensive growth. GDP growth caused only by increases in the amount of inputs available for use is called extensive growth. Measuring economic growth. The economic growth rate is calculated from data on GDP estimated by countries' statistical agencies. The rate of growth of GDP capita is calculated from data on GDP and population for the initial and final periods included in the analysis. Determinants of per capita GDP growth. In national income accounting, per capita output can be calculated using the following factors: output per unit of labor input, hours worked, the percentage of the working age population actually working and the proportion of the working age population to the total population. The rate of change of GDP population is the sum of the rates of change of these four variables plus the cross products. Productivity increases in labor productivity have historically been the most important source of real per capita economic growth. In a famous estimate, MIT professor Robert Solow concluded that technological progress has accounted for 80% of the long-term rise in U.S. per capita income, with increased investment in capital explaining only the remaining 20%. Growth measures the change in total output relative to the change in capital and labor inputs. Many of the cited references use TFP. Increases in productivity lower the real cost of goods. Over the 20th century, the real price of many goods fell by over 90%. Historical sources of productivity growth. Economic growth has traditionally been attributed to the accumulation of human and physical capital and the increase in productivity arising from technological innovation. Before industrialization, technological progress resulted in an increase in the population, which was kept in check by food supply and other resources, which acted to limit per capita income, a condition known as the Malthusian trap. The rapid economic growth that occurred during the Industrial Revolution was remarkable because it was in excess of population growth, providing an escape from the Malthusian trap. Countries that industrialized eventually saw the population growth slow down, a phenomenon known as the demographic transition. Increases in productivity are the major factor responsible for per capita economic growth. This has been especially evident since the mid-19th century. Most of the economic growth in the 20th century was due to increased output per unit of labor, materials, energy, and land. The balance of the growth in output has come from using more inputs. Both of these changes increase output. The increased output included more of the same goods produced previously and new goods and services. During the Industrial Revolution, mechanization began to replace hand methods in manufacturing, and new processes streamlined production of chemicals, iron, steel, and other products. Machine tools made the economical production of metal parts possible, so that parts could be interchangeable. See interchangeable parts. During the Second Industrial Revolution, a major factor of productivity growth was the substitution of inanimate power for human and animal labor. Also, there was a great increase in power as steam-powered electricity generation and internal combustion supplanted limited wind and water power. Since that replacement, the great expansion of total power was driven by continuous improvements in energy conversion efficiency. Other major historical sources of productivity were automation, transportation infrastructures, new materials and power, which include steam and internal combustion engines and electricity. Other productivity improvements included mechanized agriculture and scientific agriculture, including chemical fertilizers and livestock and poultry management, and the Green Revolution. Interchangeable parts made with machine tools powered by electric motors evolved into mass production, which is universally used today. Great sources of productivity improvement in the late 19th century were railroads, steamships, horse-pulled reapers and combine harvesters, and steam-powered factories. The invention of processes for making cheap steel were important for many forms of mechanization and transportation. By the late 19th century, both prices and weekly work hours fell because less labor, materials, and energy were required to produce and transport goods. However, real wages rose, allowing workers to improve their diet, buy consumer goods and afford better housing. Mass production of the 1920s created overproduction, which was arguably one of several causes of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Following the Great Depression, economic growth resumed, aided in part by increased demand for existing goods and services, such as automobiles, telephones, radios, electricity and household appliances. New goods and services included television, air conditioning and commercial aviation, creating enough new demand to stabilize the work week. The building of highway infrastructures also contributed to post-World War II growth, as did capital investments in manufacturing and chemical industries. The post-World War II economy also benefited from the discovery of vast amounts of oil around the world, particularly in the Middle East. By John W. Kendrick's estimate, 3/4 of increase in U.S. per capita GDP from 1889 to 1957 was due to increased productivity. Economic growth in the United States slowed down after 1973. In contrast, growth in Asia has been strong since then, starting with Japan and spreading to Korea, China, the Indian subcontinent and other parts of Asia. In 1957, South Korea had a lower per capita GDP than Ghana, and by 2008 it was 17 times as high as Ghana's. The Japanese economic growth has slackened considerably since the late 1980s. Productivity in the United States grew at an increasing rate throughout the 19th century and was most rapid in the early to middle decades of the 20th century. U.S. productivity growth spiked towards the end of the century in 1996 to 2004, due to an acceleration in the rate of technological innovation known as Moore's Law. After 2004, U.S. productivity growth returned to the low levels of 1972 to 96. Intensity. The workweek declined considerably over the 19th century. By the 1920s, the average work week in the U.S. was 49 hours, but the work week was reduced to 40 hours as part of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. Demographic changes. Demographic factors may influence growth by changing the employment-to-population ratio and the labor force participation rate. Industrialization creates a demographic transition in which birth rates decline and the average age of the population increases. Women with fewer children and better access market employment tend to join the labor force in higher percentages. There is a reduced demand for child labor and children spend more years in school. The increase in the percentage of women in the labor force in the U.S. contributed to economic growth, as did the entrance of the baby boomers into the workforce. See spending wave. Other factors affecting growth: political institutions, property rights, and rule of law. As institutions influence behavior and incentives in real life, they forge the success or failure of nations. Quote, "In economics and economic history, the transition to capitalism from earlier economic systems was enabled by the adoption of government policies that facilitated commerce and gave individuals more personal and economic freedom. These included new laws favorable to the establishment of business, including contract law and laws providing for the protection of private property, and the abolishment of anti-usury laws. When property rights are less certain, transaction costs can increase, hindering economic development. Enforcement of contractual rights is necessary for economic development because it determines the rate and direction of investments. When the rule of law is absent or weak, the enforcement of property rights depends on threats of violence, which causes bias against new firms because they cannot demonstrate reliability to their customers. In many poor and developing countries, much land and housing is held outside the formal illegal property ownership registration system. In many urban areas, the poor invade private government land to build their houses, so they do not hold title to these properties. Much unregistered property is held in informal form through various property associations and other arrangements. Reasons for extra-legal ownership include excessive bureaucratic red tape in buying property and building. In some countries it can take over 200 steps and up to 14 years to build on government land. Other causes of extra-legal property are failures to notarize transaction documents, or having documents notarized but failing to have them recorded with the official agency. Not having clear legal title to property limits its potential to be used as collateral to secure loans, depriving many poor countries one of the most important potential sources of capital. Unregistered businesses and lack of accepted accounting methods are other factors that limit potential capital. Businesses and individuals participating in unreported business activity and owners of unregistered property face costs such as bribes and payoffs that offset much of any taxes avoided. Capital in economics ordinarily refers to physical capital, which consists of structures and equipment used in business. Up to a point, increases in the amount of capital per worker are an important cause of economic output growth. Capital is subject to diminishing returns because of the amount that can be effectively invested and because of the growing burden of depreciation. In the development of economic theory, the distribution of income was considered to be between labor and the owners of land and capital. In recent decades, there have been several Asian countries with high rates of economic growth driven by capital investment. New products and services. Another major cause of economic growth is the introduction of new products and services and the improvement of existing products. New products create demand, which is necessary to offset the decline in employment that occurs through labor-saving technology. Growth phases and sector shares. Economic growth in the U.S. and other developed countries went through phases that affected growth through changes in the labor force participation rate and the relative sizes of economic sectors. The transition from an agricultural economy to manufacturing increased the size of the sector with high output per hour, while reducing the size of the sector with lower output per hour. Eventually, high productivity growth in manufacturing reduced the sector size, as prices fell and employment shrank relative to other sectors. The service and government sectors, where output per hour and productivity growth is low, saw increases in the shares of the economy and employment during the 1990s. The public sector has since contributed contracted, while the service economy expanded in the 2000s. Theories and models. Classical growth theory. In classical economics, the theory of production and the theory of growth are based on the theory or law of variable proportions, whereby increasing either of the factors of production, while holding the other constant and assuming no technological change, will increase output, but at a diminishing rate that eventually will approach zero. These concepts have their origins in Thomas Malthus's theorizing about agriculture. Malthus's examples included the number of seeds harvested relative to the number of seeds planted on a plot of land and the size of the harvest from a plot of land versus the number of workers employed. See diminishing returns. Criticisms of classical growth theory of the technology. The most important factor in economic growth is held constant and that economies of scale are ignored. Swan model. Robert Solow and Trevor Swan developed what eventually became the main model used in growth economics in the 1950s. This model assumes that there are diminishing returns to capital and labor. Capital accumulates through investment, but its level as stock continually decreases due to depreciation. Due to the diminishing returns to capital, with increases in capital, worker and absent technological progress, economic output, worker eventually reaches a point where capital per worker and economic output, worker remain constant because annual investment in capital equals annual depreciation. This condition is called the steady state. In the Solow-Swan model, if productivity increases through technological progress, then output, worker, increases even when the economy is in the steady state. If productivity increases at a constant rate, output, worker, also increases at a related steady state rate. As a consequence, growth in the model can occur either by increasing the share of GDP invested or through technological progress, but at whatever share of GDP invested, capital, worker, eventually converges on the steady state, leaving the growth rate of output, worker, determined only by the rate of technological progress. As a consequence, with world technology available to all and progressing at a constant rate, all countries have the same steady state rate of growth. Each country has a different level of GDP, worker, determined by the share of GDP it invests, but all countries have the same rate of economic growth. Implicitly in this model, rich countries are those that have invested a high share of GDP for a long time. Poor countries can become rich by increasing the share of GDP they invest. One important prediction of the model, mostly borne out by the data, is that of conditional convergence, the idea that poor countries will grow faster and catch up with rich countries as long as they have similar investment rates and access to the same technology. The Solow-Swan model is considered an exogenous growth model because it does not explain why countries invest different shares of GDP in capital, nor why technology improves over time. Instead, the rate of investment and the rate of technological progress are exogenous. The value of the model is that it predicts the pattern of economic growth once these two rates are specified. Its failure to explain the determinants of these rates is one of its limitations. Although the rate of investment in the model is exogenous, under certain conditions the model implicitly predicts convergence in the rates of investment across countries. In a global economy with a global financial capital market, financial capital flows to the countries with the highest return on investment. In the Solow-Swan model, countries with less capital, worker, have a higher return on investment due to the diminishing returns to capital. As a consequence, capital, worker, and output, worker, in a global financial capital market should converge to the same level in all countries. Since historically financial capital has not flowed to the countries with less capital worker, the basic Swan model has a conceptual flaw. Beginning in the 1990s, this flaw has been addressed by adding additional variables to the model that can explain why some countries are less productive than others and, therefore, do not attract flows of global financial capital even though they have less capital worker. Endogenous growth theory advanced again with theories of economists Paul Romer and Robert Lucas, Jr. in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Unsatisfied with the assumption of exogenous technological progress in the Swan model, economists worked to endogenize technology in the 1980s. They developed the endogenous growth theory that includes a mathematical explanation of technological advancement. This model also incorporated a new concept of human capital, the skills and knowledge that make workers productive. Unlike physical capital, human capital has increasing rates of return. Research done in this area has focused on what increases human capital: a technological change. Unified growth theory. Unified growth theory was developed by Edgar Law and his co-authors to address the inability of endogenous growth theory to explain key empirical regularities in the growth processes of individual economies and the world economy as a whole. Endogenous growth theory was satisfied with accounting for empirical regularities in the growth process of developed economies over the last 100 years. As a consequence, it was not able to explain the qualitatively different empirical regularities that characterized the growth process over longer time horizons in both developed and less developed economies. Unified growth theories are endogenous growth theories that are consistent with the entire process of development, and in particular the transition from the epoch of Malthusian stagnation that had characterized most of the process of development to the contemporary era of sustained economic growth. The Big Push. One popular theory in the 1940s was the Big Push, which suggested that countries needed to jump from one stage of development to another through a virtuous cycle, in which large investments in infrastructure and education coupled with private investments would move the economy to a more productive stage, breaking free from economic paradigms appropriate to a lower productivity stage. The idea was revived and formulated rigorously in the late 1980s by Kevin Murphy, Andrei Schleifer and Robert Vishny. Schumpeterian growth. Schumpeterian growth is an economic theory named after the 20th-century Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. The approach explains growth as a consequence of innovation and a process of creative destruction that captures the dual nature of technological progress. In terms of creation, entrepreneurs introduce new products or processes in the hope that they will enjoy temporary monopoly-like profits as they capture markets. In doing so, they make old technologies or products obsolete. This can be seen as an annulment of previous technologies, which makes them obsolete and destroys the rents generated by previous innovations. A major model that illustrates Schumpeterian growth is the Arguello-Hud model. Institutions and growth. According to Acemoglu, Simon Johnson and James Robinson, the positive correlation between high income and cold climate is a byproduct of history. Europeans adopted very different colonization policies in different colonies, with different associated institutions. In places where these colonizers faced high mortality rates, they could not settle permanently, and they were thus more likely to establish extractive institutions, which persisted after independence. In places where they could settle permanently, they established institutions with this objective in mind and modeled them after those in the European homelands. In these Neo-Europe's better institutions in turn produced better development outcomes. Thus, although other economists focus on the identity, a type of legal system of the colonizers to explain institutions, these authors look at the environmental conditions in the colonies to explain institutions. For instance, former colonies have inherited corrupt governments and geopolitical boundaries that are not properly placed regarding the geographical locations of different ethnic groups, creating internal disputes and conflicts that hinder development. In another example, societies that emerged in colonies without solid native populations established better property rights and incentives for long-term investment than those where native populations were large. Human capital and growth. Many theoretical and empirical analyses of economic growth attribute a major role to a country's level of human capital, defined as the skills of the population of the workforce. Human capital has been included in both neoclassical and endogenous growth models. A country's level of human capital is difficult to measure, since it is created at home, at school, and on the job. Economists have attempted to measure human capital using numerous proxies, including the population's level of literacy, its level of numeracy, its level of book production, capita, its average level of formal schooling, its average test score on international tests, and its cumulative depreciated investment in formal schooling. The most commonly used measure of human capital is the level of school attainment in a country, building upon the data development of Robert Barrow and Zhonghua Li. This measure is widely used because Barrow and Li provide data for numerous countries in 5-year intervals for a long period of time. One problem with the schooling attainment measure is that the amount of human capital acquired in a year of schooling is not the same at all levels. If schooling is not the same in all countries, this measure also presumes that human capital is only developed in formal schooling, contrary to the extensive evidence that families, neighborhoods, peers, and health also contribute to the development of human capital. Despite these potential limitations, Theodore Breton has shown that this measure can represent human capital in log linear growth models because across countries GDP adult has a log linear relationship to average years of schooling, which is consistent with the log linear relationship between workers' personal incomes and years of schooling in the Minster model. Eric Hanushek and Dennis Kimco introduced measures of students' mathematics and science skills from international assessments into growth analysis. They found that this measure of human capital was very significantly related to economic growth. Eric Hanushek and Ludger Weissman have extended this analysis. Theodore Breton shows that the correlation between economic growth and students' average test scores in Hanushek and Weissman's analyses is actually due to the relationship in countries with less than 8 years of schooling. He shows that economic growth is not correlated with average scores in more educated countries. Hanushek and Weissman further investigate whether the relationship of knowledge capital to economic growth is causal. They show that the level of students' cognitive skills can explain the slow growth in Latin America and the rapid growth in East Asia. Energy consumption and growth. Energy economic theories hold that rates of energy consumption and energy efficiency are linked causally to economic growth. A fixed relationship between historical rates of global energy consumption and the historical accumulation of global economic wealth has been observed. Increases in energy efficiency were a portion of the increase in total factor productivity. Some of the most technologically important innovations in history involved increases in energy efficiency. These include the great improvements in efficiency of conversion of heat to work, the reuse of heat, the reduction in friction and the transmission of power, especially through electrification. Electricity consumption and economic growth are strongly correlated. Per capita electric consumption correlates almost perfectly with economic development.